You're about to learn what the different types of imposter syndrome are. You're about to hear how they may be negatively impacting your tax career and life, and you'll learn how to deal with them. Our expert guest for this episode, Estelle Read, shares all of this with you after many years of helping professionals to fix burnout, remove stress, and perform better. You're listening to episode 108 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode. About 2 months back, I was asked if I'd had Estelle Read on the podcast before, and I'd actually not heard of her before, so I had to ask who she was. So Estelle is a best-selling author, coach, speaker and trainer with a focus on conquering imposter syndrome and the anxiety and stress that come with it. She mainly works with C-suite leaders, partners, directors, and HR in professional services who are anxious, stressed, time poor, and not enjoying their success. And she has a book called Inner Brilliance, How to Shine, 10 Antidotes to Imposter Syndrome, Workaholism, and Stress. Now, it came at a good time for me because I was suffering a bit with stress at the time, and it sounded interesting to me. And the 5 types of imposter syndrome that she talks about, I could relate to 2 of them, so it made me think that maybe I actually do suffer with imposter syndrome more than I thought I did. So in this episode, I thought it'd be nice to have Estelle share with us the 5 types of imposter syndrome so that you can hear about these and potentially relate with them, so that if you feel like you fall into any of these categories, you can become aware of it. So we cover that in the episode. We cover the negative impacts of imposter syndrome. We cover the benefits of dealing with it and conquering it. We talk about Estelle's SHINE process, SHINE. That's Estelle's process for dealing with imposter syndrome. Then also the little bit for me at the end, which says about like how I intend to use what I've learned so far to tackle any imposter syndrome that I have, and to make me feel less stressed and I suppose enjoy work and life more overall and worry less about things that are probably in reality trivial. The rough timings for each section of the episode can be found in the details section of the episode within your podcast player of choice, or you can find them by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP108. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP108. Estelle actually has loads of free resources that can help you with everything that's talked about in this episode. And there's a link to that in the show notes too, so that you can have a look at those and take advantage of those free resources. You can also have a free discovery session with her as well if you're interested in using her services to tackle and deal with any imposter syndrome. Just 2 things quickly before we get into the episode then. I just want to mention about the Tax Advice Masterclass that I'm running in November this year. It's the last 2 weeks in November. The Tax Advice Masterclass is there to help people know how to provide tax advice that clients actually want and value, and also how to provide that. So it's not going to turn you into an absolute expert in providing tax advice at the end of it, but what it will give you is the tools to go and use, go and practice, so then you are able to provide that high quality tax advice that clients will really value. I had some feedback from someone recently who enrolled 2 of their staff on my last tax advice masterclass, and they've seen good progress with one of the people in particular after coming on that. So they didn't see like an immediate improvement, like, the day after the course was done, but a few months after, this person can see a big improvement in the advice that one of her team members is producing on the back of it, which is always nice to hear, because that's the reason that I do these courses, after all, is to help people to get better. The other thing I want to mention is that Corona Eye, that provides tax resources, tax guidance, and it's the online platform that I use. They're actually offering free trials to people who listen to the podcast, and the free trial is for 1 month at a time, which I think is pretty good. So it's open to those that are practicing in tax, working in tax right now, whether you're in-house, in practice, it doesn't really matter, but to get access to that trial, you do need to be working in tax. So if you're interested in that free trial, you just need to head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/Krona. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes so that you can see that and access that. And all you need to do is basically register for that trial. For the Tax Advice Masterclass, you can head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses, and that's where you can find the full details and details of how to enroll there. If you're an individual wanting to enroll yourself, essentially, even if your employer's paying, then that page is the best way to go about it and to enroll. But if you're an employer and you're interested in enrolling some of your staff, or you're a manager, you're interested in enrolling some of your staff, it's better actually to get in contact with me, because we can work together to figure out who's relevant in your team or in the wider practice, and I suppose enroll those if it turns out that that's something that you would like to do. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to the episode. If you don't mind then, Estelle, could you just start off by telling us a little bit about you and your journey to helping people working in professional services?
Yeah, sure. So I am a coach, trainer, author of best-selling book, Inner Brilliance, How to Shine, 10 Antidotes to Imposter Syndrome, Workaholism and Stress. And I set up my business having worked in the professional services industry. Probably, I'm trying to think when I started, it was back in 2000 when I worked at a local firm in Derby called the Smith Partnership. And I fell into coaching like a lot of coaches do, started coaching partners, and that's predominantly where I work now. I work with C-suite leaders, people often that sit around a boardroom table, brilliant people that actually just don't realise how brilliant they are, hence the imposter syndrome slant.
Yeah. And didn't you have a bit of like trouble yourself with imposter syndrome in the past? Well, I actually brought your book very recently. I'm only about a third of the way through, so I've just got a bit of information, a bit of an insight into your journey as well so far.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, absolutely. I have definitely had the t-shirt, worn it, and then taken it off. And I will share certainly parts of my story as we go throughout today. But I had it that bad that I made myself really poorly, and I ended up burning out completely because I was a complete workaholic, and it links to some of the different types of imposter syndrome, which I know we'll get into as part of the process today. And yeah, ended up being told by the doctors, look, there's no cure for ME, chronic fatigue. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair in bed. And being the typical achiever, I just thought that I am not going to kind of lie down and take this on the chin. But fortunately, I think also being in the coaching industry, I just thought, I know there's a better way. And my whole book is based on that premise. But what was interesting is the sorts of clients that I was then attracting in were also burnt out, tired, exhausted. As I said earlier, brilliant people, but people that just didn't realise how brilliant they were. And there was this real disconnect between the results that they were getting, the position they held in the organisation, and their self-perception. And that's how I started getting curious with it, really, I guess. And did recover, made a full recovery. I'm happy to say, and I lead a very active life now here up in the lakes.
Yeah. So actually, wasn't until about probably 2 months ago when I first kind of came across you. I was speaking to a tax partner at work, and they said that someone else at PK Smith Cooper had coaching from you, and he refers to himself as someone that's like a pre and post Estelle. And I didn't know before speaking to this guy either that there's potentially more than one type of imposter syndrome. I think you advocate that there's 5 different types. So like, I suppose, what are these then? What is your perspective on imposter syndrome? What does it actually mean when you're talking about imposter syndrome?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing to say is that imposter syndrome was a phrase that was coined. It was back in the 70s by 2 doctors, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And initially, when they did their research, they thought it just affected women, but subsequent studies have identified that it affects both men and women equally. In fact, 70% of the population suffer with it. And your typical person that suffers with IS is somebody who they think they're a fraud, their success is down to luck, and that they're always waiting for that tap on the shoulder and waiting to be found out, and that others are mistaken when it comes to their success, their achievements, and where they've got in life. But the 5 types of imposter syndrome is some theory from another doctor, a lady called Dr. Valerie Young. And the first type is the expert, which was absolutely the category that I fell into. And their belief is that they don't know enough. And for me personally, this related to having undiagnosed learning difficulties back in the 80s. If you were struggling to learn things quickly, you were put on the thick table with all the other misfits at school. And I knew I had more to give. And that's why my strapline is optimizing brilliance, because I think we all have the potential to be brilliant. But I just didn't know what was up with me. And so then what happens is we develop behavioral coping strategies to move away from that limiting belief. And so, but the difficulty with that is that we then self-sabotage. And so for me, that looked like reading endless books, never knowing enough, qualifying in loads of different courses and qualifications, overdoing knowledge, so to speak. And again, I remember working with one gentleman, and he was like a fountain of knowledge. In fact, he was an accountant, and he was sat in the corner of the office, really kind of valued everything that he knew, but actually it got in the way of his performance, and he would procrastinate, he'd miss hitting his targets because he was that focused on gaining information as opposed to delivering kind of the nuts and bolts of his job. So the second type is the perfectionist, and this is really about people not being able to make mistakes. So again, when it comes to self-sabotaging behaviors, what that looks like is checking and double checking our work, also being really self-critical. And, it's almost like, well, when is good enough? And we're forever moving the bar higher and higher. And we, to a position that we never actually reach. And typically we tend to be our own worst critics, and I'll be coming on to our inner critic in a bit. But again, I remember working with one gentleman, and the way that this transpired for him is that he would go through everything with a fine-tooth comb, which would take extra time. So again, that's self-sabotaging behavior. And he, whatever work he produced, it was never good enough. The next type is the natural genius. And this is to do with, if we can't instantly do something, again, we don't feel good enough. And I'm smiling because this reminds me of my husband, because he is a natural genius. He's dead clever, although he would never admit to being dead clever. He was invited to study at Oxford, in truth, decided that he didn't fit in. That's classic imposter syndrome stuff going on. And when but what's interesting with the natural genius is they'll always say, I'm not a genius though. And the difficulty with this type of imposter syndrome is that we delay starting things because we're not naturally brilliant at things straight away, or we give up too soon because we can't instantly do something. And again, I remember my husband considering learning to play the guitar, and he did one lesson and then put it down. It's still in the garage gathering dust because he couldn't instantly do it. And then the next category type is the soloist. And this is about, so the belief is, I'm a failure or I'm a fraud if I can't do it on my own. So what's interesting about this, I see this a lot in leaders that are second or last born. So in other words, they have siblings and they like to be able to do everything themselves. Now I'm making a sweeping generalization there, just anecdotally saying what I experienced. But again, I remember one leader that I worked with, and this is again where we can self-sabotage our performance. He believed he had to do everything himself and therefore wouldn't delegate to the rest of his team members. And the challenge with that is that we end up with too much on our production line. But also the team, whoever you're managing or leading, then feels frustrated because there's not natural development and growth. And then the final type, again, this was me. So often you'll find that people they'll connect with at least one or sometimes all of the different type. But the final type is the superhuman. And this is about succeeding in all areas of life. Otherwise, we feel like an imposter. And this is where imposter syndrome starts to leak into our private life as well. So we try to be absolutely brilliant at everything. So that could be being a parent, a partner, a business person, a family member, a friend. For me, it was, I've got to be school governor as well. Not only am I running a business and trying to be all things to men and women, I'm going to add lots of other things to my to-do list as well. But of course, the difficulty with that is that if we are trying to be all things to everyone, is that, again, we're at risk of burning out, but also turning into a doaholic or a workaholic. So I often work with workaholics as well.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the 5 types.
Yeah, the one that kind of resonates with me the most is the perfectionist one. So, like, even over like just the last month or so, I did a piece of work for one client where I needed to do some research around some tax rules for it. And probably within an hour, I got to a point where I was pretty confident with the answer. But then for probably another 4 hours, I was doing more research because I kept thinking, well, what if I have missed something? What if I have missed something? So I literally wanted to like turn over every single page of the book type thing. And, that extra 4 hours added absolutely nothing to the piece of advice I ended up giving to the client. So in essence, it was a wasted 4 hours. And it was something I couldn't even charge the client for either because it was outside of the scope or further than the scope of work that we had there. So there's kind of that side. And also I kind of obsess about certain things. So at the moment, for example, I'm trying to get better at storytelling. And I literally spend way too much time of my day at the moment re-watching videos, rereading parts of a book that I've got on it, retrying like different strategies and stuff. Almost like an endless pursuit of trying to just get better for the sake of getting better,
Yeah.
So I think that's
Yeah.
definitely the one that I fall into.
Yeah. And, what you say, is entirely normal, Jack. And I've heard so many different versions of those sorts of stories. So, relax and be easy. And in a moment, I'll share with you my 5-step shine process. And one of the things that is important is the relationship we have with ourselves. So I'll be talking to you about having an inner captain as opposed to an inner critic, and how we can first of all, catch ourselves doing those things. And I'll explain why that's difficult, but then how we then correct it.
Yeah. I know some of this is probably obvious, but like, what would you say like the main, or if not all the negative impacts of imposter syndrome? So I know in your case, it sounds like it made you quite ill. And I know in my case, it's made me pretty stressed at times, but like, are there any other things that are like negative impacts of suffering from these elements of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, definitely. Most of my clients are either stressed, burnt out, the joy of life has dissipated because they're so obsessed about work and getting that right that even during their off time, they can't relax. The mind's still going. And again, I remember when I did my work, I remember being out with the family and we were at Colcabby in the Midlands, and it was the first time I remember was sat on a monument, and I thought, do you know what? There's nothing going on upstairs. That inner dialogue had just quietened. I felt at peace. I could really be present with my family. And that was my reason for getting better was, I'd just had a little girl and, at its worst, I couldn't lift her out of a car seat. I sometimes had to crawl upstairs on my hands and knees. My adrenal glands were that knackered. So they became my reason why for recovering. But yeah, it can be really quite toxic if it's left untreated.
Yeah. I can really relate with some of these things, to be fair. I really struggle to switch off. So I can finish work and then 2.5 hours later, I can still be thinking about it. And my wife sometimes is talking to me and she'll just go, "Didn't hear a word of that, did you?" And I'm like, "No, I'm really sorry, I didn't. My mind's still going about work." And then it can still continue up until going to bed as well. So then it affects my sleep as well. So it's like a lot of knock-on effects. So I can entirely relate to a lot of
Yes.
those.
And sleep is one of the things that in fact, do you want me to get into it rather than keep signposting?
You can. You can
share
jump
with
straight into it if you want to.
But that is certainly part of the E of the acronym, which is about enabling rest, relaxation, recharge, which, I will come on to. So SHINE, so this is a 5-step framework that will help you conquer imposter syndrome, workaholism or overworking, and stress. So it's designed to hit all of those points because those are the common traits that I notice when I'm working with people with imposter syndrome. So the acronym SHINE stands for, so S is self-assessment, and I'll dig into each one in a sec. H stands for haven, I stands for inner captain, N stands for your non-negotiables, and then E is about enable. So like with any change, the first step is always to look at where we're at now, which is why I encourage people to do a self-assessment. So typically I will run a workaholism assessment with people. You can find them on the internet, so you can get them for free, a stress assessment, and also an imposter syndrome assessment. So it's taking a snapshot of what's going on right now for that individual. And the reason being, so the reason it's important that we do this self-assessment is that basically we're on autopilot. So at best, we are 5% conscious choice. I like to think my coachees are 5% conscious choice. Your average human being is only 1% conscious choice. So most of the time, our behavior is coming from our unconscious mind or our autopilot. So we are 99% on autopilot. And for those of you that drive, think about how you got to work. Were you doing mirror signal maneuver, or did you just arrive at your destination without much thought? And that's what happens, is that when we become competent at something for it, or at a skill, a behavior, a belief, our unconscious mind just takes care of it for us, which is, as I say, our autopilot. So that's why we have to take time to sit back, reflect, and do this self-assessment. So again, when I'm working with cheese, I will get them to reflect on position A. So what's happening right now? So years ago, I remember working, so I work a lot in the knowledge industry. So imposter syndrome does seem to affect people in the knowledge industry. And I was working with this particular individual, and the managing partner said to me, so position A, what was happening right now is that she was bringing in $4,000 a month. Now, most law firms have a magic formula in terms of how much income they need that individual to bring in order for it to be a viable position. So that was position A. Position B was, so position B is often the goal. What do you want instead? Position B was, well, we need her in at 12K a month for her to be viable. That's her fee target. Now, so it sounds like, well, that's just a numbers thing. But actually, when we started to dig beneath the surface, there was loads of imposter syndrome driving the underperformance of this particular individual, which I will share more of their story as we get into the rest of the process. But really digging into what's in your unconscious mind starts to put you in charge of your results, your behavior. So raising that self-awareness will put you, so in my book, I talk about being the captain of your ship. So rather than just being on this autopilot, be more consciously aware of your thoughts, your behaviors, and your beliefs. And I've got loads of free resources, by the way, which help you to do all of the stuff that I'm sharing with you today. But most people don't tend to do this first step because, one, they didn't realize they were on autopilot, but two, they're also not consciously aware of the root cause of their behavior. And often nobody's actually sat and listened to the language, or they've never sat and listened to their own language. Now, your language is key to what's going on in your unconscious mind, so in that autopilot. And regardless of whether you have a coach or not, using a tool like journaling, and I've got a free journaling template that's based on this process, enables you to look at your language so that you understand what it is that's driving your behavior.
Just another quick mention of the tax advice masterclass, which the next one is in November of this year, in the last 2 weeks in November. So if you're interested in taking a look at this, whether it's for yourself or for people in your team or wider firm, then I can advocate just adding an action onto your to-do list now, or sending an email to yourself to remind you to have a look at this, because let's face it, as you're listening to this podcast right now, you're probably not going to go and stop the podcast and go and look at the details, etc. But what I always do in cases like this is I just send a quick email to myself so that I can pick it up from my inbox and actually do something with it rather than accidentally forget about it. So that's what I advocate you do if you're interested in the tax advice masterclass for you or for people in your team or wider firm. And then the other thing to mention is the Corona Eye free month trial to their tax resources and tax guidance. It's the guidance that I always start with whenever I'm doing any research at all. They've got all the up-to-date legislation, they've got case law, they've got news, they've got lots of different types of guidance, some that's more in-depth, some that's more overview level. They've basically got some guidance that suits almost every scenario anyway. So if you want details of the masterclass, what you need to do is head on over to the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. So there's a link to that in the show notes. And if you're interested in the Corona Eye free trial, just head on over to the show notes for this episode, which are at the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP108. There'll be a link to a page where you can register for that 3-month trial. Let's get back to the episode.
Yeah. So that moves on to step 2 in the SHINE process, which is H, and that's for haven. So, and it's about havening away those triggers that are actually in that autopilot, so that effectively what we're doing is we're reprogramming your autopilot and we're cheating change. So our autopilot, it was created in our childhood. So in terms of our personality, it's a mix of, and there's all sorts of different theories about personality. So they reckon we are 1/3 DNA and 2/3 nurture. Now, so it's the nature versus nurture model. So the most important time in anyone's life is age 0 to 7. This is referred to as the imprint period. And during that period, we are learning about what we're capable of, what we're competent in, what do we believe about ourselves, what we're afraid of, how loved, liked, appreciated are we, how safe and secure is our environment, how do we handle conflict with other people. And our personality is influenced by the significant people that are in our environment. So this can be school teachers, family members, so grandparents, parents, but also friends as well. So, and going back to the lawyer who was bringing in 4K a month, but needed to bring in 12K a month, when I got talking with her, so we did lots of practical things. So I said to her, so what do you think's getting in the way of your best performance? And there was the classic, well, I'm not time recording. I don't like charging clients. Now, you'll know in your industry, Jack, you need to put a bill in, don't you? Yeah. Otherwise, you don't hit your fee target. But also, so she would turn a blind eye to some of the work that she was doing, wasn't charging her clients. So we did some practical things that kind of shifted the needle a little, but it was only by a few K. It wasn't where she needed to go. And she said, well, I just don't feel good enough. And I've never felt good enough. Now, if I said to you, this lady was an Oxbridge graduate. And so again, there was a disconnect between, wow, well, first of all, you're a lawyer, which is amazing. Second of all, you're an Oxbridge graduate, so you're really clever. And yet you still don't feel good enough. And when we started digging into her past, so I said to her, how long have you not felt good enough? And she said, well, my first recollection of that was in the classroom, age 5. The teacher said, what letter is this? And she held up the letter A. And so she put her hand up. Now think about how we feel in meetings, in presentations, in, any scenario where there's other people and we want to speak up, because this is a really common thing that people don't like doing presentations, or they don't like speaking up during meetings. And often it's because there are connections with memories like the one I'm about to share. So first day of school, She puts her hand up, was very brave, and she said, "That's the letter A." And the teacher said, "We don't say that in this class, we say A." So the teacher was actually being pedantic. They were obviously doing phonics or something like that. But what she took away from that moment was that, one, I make mistakes. So she developed this thing around perfectionism. Because we developed behavioral coping strategies then. So I have to be perfect. If I'm perfect, I can't be criticized and I won't be making mistakes. But she also developed this thing around not knowing enough. So she had the expert type of imposter syndrome as well. So that was the focus for our work. And as I say, we use something called havening, which I'll come on to. And the challenge with this autopilot, this stuff that's created in our childhood, and one of the reasons that we find change challenging is that it takes the average person 66 days to change a habit or a behavior. So first of all, you imagine the grit, determination, effort to overcome something that actually doesn't feel safe. So, for this person, it was, public humiliation, shame, putting a hand up, getting something wrong. And again, what we do is we develop these behavioral coping strategies. So, for example, when a memory like that gets encoded in the brain, and it gets encoded in a part of the brain called the amygdala, often there's shame involved. And that was the case for her. So the belief that came out of that was, I'm not good enough, I get things wrong, but also I don't belong to this group. And that's exactly how she felt in a business. She was sat on a table of lawyers that were the same level of qualification, but she felt like she didn't belong to that group of people. That's why she felt like an imposter, because she didn't feel as good as them. And again, it was just a mirror image or an echo from her past when she was at school. Now, when people have a fear of getting things wrong or a fear of failure, the typical behavioral coping strategies that people develop is, so sometimes it can be, right, keep your head down, which was exactly what she was doing. She had so much more to offer. Don't put yourself forward. Again, if I don't put myself forward, I'm not at risk of being criticized. Try and be perfect so that you don't get anything wrong and you can't be criticized. But do you know what? The biggest critic is the one in your own head, which again, we'll come on to in a sec. Or learn loads of information so that you get things right. So that's how we can, Jack, you were referring to going off and doing your research. That's again how we can get sucked into that type of cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all very well and good, isn't it? It's like, oh, great. Okay, so it takes us 66 days to change, and we've got to be really brave, and we've got to overcome all those inner feelings, and we've got these behavioral coping strategies that actually don't serve us. So what, therefore, is the solution? And the solution is that we need to scramble or break the neural pathway where that memory is encoded in the unconscious mind, which holds the trigger to these behavioral coping strategies, thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. So we use a technology called havening. When I qualified, or I started using havening 10 years ago, and when I qualified, which was about 9 years ago, I was number 50 in the UK. So it was a really new technology. There are, thousands of us globally now, but it's something that's been designed by a guy called Dr. Ron Rudin. He's a GP medic, neuroscientist. Him and his brother designed it. They spent 7 years researching, and they identified that when we think about a memory, so it doesn't have to be a childhood memory, it can be any memory. And when we use the Havening Touch, and again, I've got a free 2-minute video that shows you how you can use Havening yourself. It's really, really easy to use. So when you use the Havening Touch, it produces delta waves, which is a type of brain wave, serotonin, which is a feel-good neurotransmitter, and something called calcineurin, which is the magic ingredient. And as the person thinks about that childhood event, you imagine there's a neural pathway, and at one end, you've got a postsynaptic neuron with some receptors that pop out. So imagine they're like bumps that pop out, and those receptors are responsible for making us experience or being triggered in a moment. So, for example, you're in a meeting, one of the partners asks you a question, all eyes are on you, and all of a sudden you're in the spotlight. You feel triggered. You feel embarrassed. You're thinking, oh my God, I don't want to get the question wrong. I want to get it right. You start second guessing yourself. So those will be all clues. Maybe you get palpitations, maybe you go red. They used to call me Blusher Read. I used to blush a lot. And so these are all clues that you have been triggered. So once your brain starts to produce this calcineurin, what it does is it gets into those receptors, and these receptors, they're made to come in and out. And the idea is, so think about your brain a little bit like a fingerprint matching machine, like you see on these detective programs. So your brain is on the lookout for situations that spell danger. And once it spots that danger, then, as I say, these receptors come out and we get triggered. But what that magic ingredient does is it makes the receptors retract, but permanently retract. So often when I'm working with clients, sometimes they will say, I can't even think what we were having in. What was the memory? So the small print is that you don't want to haven anything that you've got to go to court for, because you wouldn't make a very good witness. In some cases, when people use havening, so take, for example, it's coming up to my dad's 3rd anniversary when he passed away 3 years ago in October. And I can very unemotionally talk about when my dad was dying. And that's because I've havened it. And I can't recall, I could tell you what happened, but I can't see the scenes when I was in that room with him when he was dying. I just can't bring it back to mind. I can't see it, I can't hear it, and I can't feel it. I could tell you, as I say, but I'm not emotionally triggered by that anymore. So once the havening process is complete, it is literally like cheating change. So back to the lawyer, the lady who had to go from 4K months to 12K months. Actually, what she did is she went from 4K months to 16K months. She became the best junior fee earner on that particular table that she was sat on. And this is typical of havening results, in that people they'll come back usually after about session 3, session 4, depending on what their agenda is. And they'll say, well, you never guess what. I'll say, what? And it was like one partner I was working with, he said to me, I've just had £1 million conversation. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I have procrastinated for 18 months over having a conversation with a fellow partner because I didn't want to upset them. I didn't want them to not like me. And with this particular individual, they had a fear of conflict. They had a fear of rejection. And so having any difficult conversations was, again, a risky and unsafe thing for them to do. So in traditional coaching, and this is one of the reasons why I started using havening, traditional coaching is about having a very conscious-minded approach to tackling an issue. So what's happening now? What's the issue? Position B, what's the outcome that you want? Right, what are all the practical steps that will take you from A to B? But quite early on in my coaching career, I got frustrated because people, inner stuff, would get in the way of the outer results because they were being triggered. And so if at the start of the coaching program with this £1 million conversation guy, I'd said to him, right, we just need to have the conversation. Let's work out what you're going to say. He would have come back and just not had the conversation because it just didn't feel safe. Whereas once the triggers have been removed for an individual, what it does is it frees them up. So you probably have heard the phrase, the mind will take the path of least resistance, and that's the neural pathway. Because the neural pathway is broken, it frees them up to act and behave authentically in the way in which they want to behave. But, I am on a mission to spread the word about havening. A lot of people, either one, are unaware of it, two, they're skeptical, they think, oh, it's not going to work for me. I've tried everything. I've tried counselling, therapy, I've read endless self-help books, and I was totally there. I always start out as a healthy skeptic, and I will resist things, but once they work for me, then I will absolutely use them with my clients. And, havening, again, this was my own imposter syndrome at work. So I am a qualified coach and also a qualified HR professional. Once I wasn't satisfied with any of those things, even when I got the certificates and I got the cap and gown, I still didn't know enough. I still wasn't good enough. So I then qualified as an NLP, that's neuro-linguistic programming practitioner, master practitioner, trainer of NLP. I became a hypnotherapist, an EFT, emotional freedom technique practitioner, an integral eye movement therapist. So all these qualifications, some of them, made some changes, but the thing that really made a difference, as I say, was havening.
Yeah.
So the next step is to use, so step 3 is I for inner captain, so that you challenge your inner critic. So we all have an inner critic, and that's because in a study, it's the National Science Foundation, they identified that 80% of our thoughts are negative and 20% of our thoughts are positive. So there's 20% sunshine. But that's a lot of negativity, isn't it? And the other thing is that 95% of our thoughts are exactly the same as the day before. So I refer to this as Groundhog Day. It's like rinse and repeat. Now, whilst that sounds really negative, for me, always the optimist, I think, well, that's great scope for change. There is something that we can do about that. But again, we've got to come off this autopilot in order to change what's going on at a deeper level. And the reason the way in which we talk to ourselves is important because, and so this is the neuroscience behind words, negative words, whether spoken, heard, so that's why you shouldn't listen to the news in the morning, folks, or thought. So in other words, your inner critic release stress and anxiety hormones. So for example, I remember during the pandemic, I couldn't watch Boris because he was just filling my head full of lots of negative thoughts. So again, it's being aware of what are you exposing yourself to. And it's based on an outdated system, so something called negativity bias, which our ancestors, it was useful for staying alive. We had to be more attentive to negative stimulus, because it helped. It was a crucial role in terms of survival. So what our inner captain looks like. So first of all, we've got to raise awareness of what sorts of thoughts we're having, but also what sorts of things we're saying to other people and catching our language. And again, one of the things that I would recommend you do is that you start journaling. And if you sat there thinking, what, you mean like Adrian Mole, age 13 3/4, dear diary, that isn't what journaling is about. And I've designed a process which, again, is based on neuroscience. It's based on challenging your imposter syndrome thoughts so that you start to, again, raise awareness of what's going on, but also change those thoughts. So an example of that would be, so years ago when my book was published, I got invited to the Derby Book Festival. And what was intriguing is that in the email inviting me, they said to me, they were trying to persuade and convince me to go and present at their book festival. And yet for me, I was really honoured that I'd been invited. And in their letter of persuasion was the long list, basically, of amazingly successful people. So you'd got the guy who wrote The Chimp Paradox, you'd got the CEO of Timpson's, and also a gold medal winner. And So my immediate thought was, in that moment, what do they want with little old Estelle Read from Ashby de la Zouche? And so the old me would have gone like down in a spiral, going, oh my God, I can't do this. Head below the parapet. You're a total imposter. You can't do this. But again, once we reduce those triggers, what you're going to find is, so reducing your triggers through havening is, what you'll find is you can have less inner dialogue, negative inner dialogue, but also you're going to find that you're going to be more resilient. And all of a sudden, my inner coach, inner captain, as I refer to it in my book, kicked in. And I said to myself, hang on a minute. Everybody has to start somewhere. And this is your start as an author. And so that just completely put a different spin on it. So that's your inner captain. The next step is N for non-negotiables. And these are your rules and your personal boundaries. And the reason we need rules and boundaries is that, first of all, globally, we are working way too many hours. So in a 2016 study of 488 million people, they identified that people were working too many hours, more than 55 hours a week. And this exposure was attributed to just over 745,000 deaths. So a lot of people die from work-related stress. So they reckon in the last study that I looked at, over 120,000 people die from work-related stress every year. But also it then has an impact and people have disability-adjusted lives after that. The other reason it's important that we have boundaries, time and people boundaries, is that we've got information overload. We have the same amount of information to process in a week that our ancestors 100 years ago processed in a lifetime. And if you think about, our brain is a little bit like a factory. At one end, we've got input, which is all the information that we're exposed to. In the middle is the process, which is our mind. And then the output is our state of mind. And so the classic thing is social media. Social media news. In the olden days, we used to sit and look at our parents looking at the newspaper. Now, it's like we walk around with a newspaper and a computer in our hand all the time. And, I've just come back from my holiday and I absolutely use an autoresponder, not only on my emails, but also on WhatsApp. In fact, I need to remember my phone is still on Do Not Disturb. And people will say to me, but hey, you run a business. What if you lose business? I may lose business. That's the truth of it. But on my voicemail, I say, look, you can book a free discovery call on this link. The same applies on all the links on my autoresponders as well. But do you know what? We only get holiday time how many times a year? And I know that if my performance is going to be at its best for my clients, but also I'm going to be at my best for my family, I need to take those breaks. And so having those boundaries like that is really important. But the other reason why your non-negotiables is important, particularly your people boundaries. So one of the other trends that I've noticed is that people suffer with what I refer to as good egg syndrome. So this is about everyone else first and you last. But also the other trait I've noticed with people with imposter syndrome is that they are overly responsible. So, they are that person who's, when the leader is saying, who's going to take this task on board, they are the person that's saying, oh yeah, it's all right, I'll do that. But do you know what? They're doing that in business, but also probably in home life, in personal life as well. And I used to do that in my own family. Oh, it's all right, I'll organise that. And of course, all these yeses when actually we should be saying, so often we'll say yes without thinking about the consequences of what we're saying no to. So when we say yes, what we actually say no to, is it no to time at the gym? Is it no to, story time with your child? Is it no to rest and relaxation when you're on holiday? So it's just being aware of that. And, again, often people don't think about this, so the reason people don't implement the non-negotiables, one is that we take our health and well-being for granted. We think we are invincible. That's definitely what I felt like in my 30s. I'm now 51. And, I certainly when I burnt out, I just thought I'll go on and on and on. And I ignored all the signs from body that I was getting sick. And in reality, we've only got 4 hours a day, 4 good hours. So, as accountants, you've got 4 good knowledge hours a day. So that could be, so for me, my 4 good hours are focused on clients. I won't see any more than 2 clients a day. And the rest of the time is focused on admin, the lower kind of functioning type activities. So, the final step in the process is E, which is about enable. And it's enabling rest, recharge, refuel, recreation. And it links to the point that I was making earlier that we think we're invincible. And in truth, you can do all the other steps, but if you don't take care of your body, you're still not going to shine on the outside. And this is because, and it's interesting. In fact, I've just published an article this afternoon talking about how our body or our unconscious mind will communicate when we're suppressing things at an unconscious level. It will communicate through pain. And I shared the story today about on holiday, we had a bit of an unfortunate situation. We arrived at our cottage and it was really awful. And when you look forward to a holiday and holidays are precious, it was absolutely filthy. And I felt really irritated by it. And, this was then presented by pain in my gallbladder. And I am a woman of a certain age, and it is a typical thing that affects females. But it was, again, that was a sign. So in the olden days, I would have just ignored that. But actually, that was a sign from my unconscious mind that there's something to pay attention to here, either an unresolved emotional issue, and that was anger at the cottage owner. Because when we looked in the visitor book, there was pages and pages of complaints, and they'd just not been dealt with. In the end, we checked into a really nice hotel, so it was all good in the end. But the reason our rest, recharge, refuel, and recreation is important is that, and I'm talking about we take for granted our health is, so there are cells in our body called mitochondria. These are responsible for producing our energy. And so again, when we get close to burnout, when we get stressed, we can damage our mitochondria. And so they become less effective. It's the equivalent of putting, not Duracell batteries in whatever device you're putting them in, but maybe putting the cheaper brand batteries that run out a lot quicker. And it's the same with our bodies. And so making sure that we are refueling our bodies with nutritious whole food. So, I remember again, when I got diagnosed, I saw a nutritionist. I paid for private care in the end. And she said, your adrenal glands are that shattered. Well, they're as about as shattered as they could be. And she said, so therefore you can't have caffeine, alcohol. I'm trying to think, I wasn't allowed any wheat, any sugar. It was like all the good stuff, excluding all the good stuff so that I could give my body time to recover. But also I remember when I was researching my book that I read a study about the impact of food on our state of mind. And so take, for example, donuts can make you angry. And this is to do with the trans fats. So actually how we fuel our body influences our state of mind, and our state of mind influences our performance at work, how sharp we are. But also whatever we do during the day. So Jack, you were talking about that sometimes your sleep gets affected with a constant whirring mind. You're absolutely right. Whatever we, if we are, so one of the things I'll talk to clients about is the different brain waves that we experience. So alpha, theta, delta, beta. So when we spend too much time, for example, in focused concentration throughout the day, so if we go back to back Zoom meetings or team meetings and we don't take a break in between, you can see again studies where people's cortisol level just spike all the way through day. So we're spinning too fast. Our brain is spinning too fast, and we're not spending enough time in alpha brainwave, which is the rest and digest relaxation response. So is it any wonder, therefore, that, we end up not being able to digest our food at lunchtime, and then we end up with irritable bowel syndrome? Why we end up then going home, cranky with our partners, and then we get into bed and our mind is still spinning at 100 miles an hour. And typically what will happen is that person will either lay in bed staring at the ceiling, or they'll crash out completely, and then they'll wake up in the middle of the night because they've not spent enough time during the day relaxing. So they've had too much theta wave. And so the brain has woken them up during the night because they've had too many thoughts to process. So again, then we end up looking at the ceiling. So the basics of the enable. So first of all, I can recommend getting a hobby. I'm a real believer in physical hobbies. So I'm a big paddleboarder living up in the lakes. The other day I said to my husband, said to my family, I need to go and get on the lake. I need to go and paddle. I just got to go reset. Now, paddleboarding is really relaxing, but also because balance is involved, it's mentally challenging as well. And it means that I'm not then thinking about anything else. And so paddleboarding, skiing, horse riding, anything that's physical and a bit of a challenge, but your hobbies will also help create those natural recreation and work-life boundaries as well. Absolutely think about your food, whole food, and then also think about your sleep hygiene. So in other words, I sleep with an eye mask on, so our blinds aren't particularly good. Make sure you've got a comfortable bed. The number of times, I hear people say that the bed is uncomfortable, invest in if you can afford it, invest in a decent mattress, decent pillows, decent duvet. Make sure your environment is conducive to sleep, but also treat yourself like a baby. So for those of you that have got young children, you'll know the importance of a bedtime routine to gradually, you don't expect your baby to go from full-on activity to sleep. There are various gears leading up to sleep. And again, these are the brain gears, changing brain waves. So, you might start with a bath and then a story and dimming the lights. And the same applies for us as adults. We forget, again, because we're on autopilot and life is busy, to take care of our basic needs. Mm-hmm. But that's it in essence. So that's your SHINE acronym. So self-assessment, Haven, I for inner captain, N for your non-negotiables, your boundaries, and then E is about enabling your recharge, your refuel, and recreation. And as I say, I've got loads of free resources on my Linktree page where you can help, you can access help with all of that stuff.
Someone who goes through this SHINE process, then, like, what are the benefits to them? Like, what do you typically see in like your clients and people that you help?
Yeah, sure. So it can be performance improvement, so fee improvement. It can be just, going back to the gentleman that was talking about earlier, he had his £1 million conversation. The other benefits were, so he was a workaholic. He had way too many cases. He was managing way too many people. He was a person that said yes and should have been saying no. When we were looking at his coaching agenda, I said, how do you want things to be different instead? And he said, well, do you know what? My wife's not been very well. I want to spend time with her. I want to be able to spend time in the garden. I want to be able to get on the golf course, and I want to work fewer hours. Now, again, traditional coaching would say, right, okay, let's work out a strategy for creating those behaviour changes. But in truth, we didn't have any strategy at all. All we did was get rid of the triggers, and then it freed him up because he wasn't being triggered to experience those things. He dramatically reduced his workload. He got on the golf course. He had his first holiday and actually used his autoresponder. So the number of people, so another little tip, if you're the sort of person that says, I am currently away, I have got limited access to my emails. Either you've got access or you haven't.
Yeah.
Use your autoresponder the way it should be used. Don't have this kind of halfway house because, again, what you're doing is you're blurring your boundaries. But yeah, so he had his first holiday without answering any emails, reduced his hours. And in essence, and, Jack, I'm a big believer in we only live once. He was happier because before, when he came to work with me, he was stressed, he was anxious, he was depressed, and he was off work sick. And, after 3 sessions, we returned to work. After 4 sessions, we were done.
So I'm just going to talk very briefly then about how I intend to use what I've learned from Estelle so far, what I've learned from her book, etc. Because I think there was a lot of information provided throughout this episode, and I think it might be helpful for you to see how I might go away and use some of this information. So the big thing for me is definitely going to be the self-assessment element, the S in the SHINE process. So I'm going to start monitoring basically when I start feeling stressed or uncomfortable, so that I can essentially figure out what my triggers are for feeling like that. So I've already started doing that, and I've realised one actually just this week, which is if someone asks me to do something and I know I haven't got time to do it, I'm okay at saying no in the first instance and pushing back. But then if they come back and basically go, oh, we really need your help now, that second time I find it difficult to say no. But if I say yes, that does result in me feeling stressed because I basically know that I haven't got time to deal with it. So I know that is a trigger for me, and so I'm working with that so that I don't basically say, yes, I'll help on that second time, and instead that I basically stand firm but try and be a little bit helpful in the meantime. The other thing that I'm definitely doing is being cautious about what I'm filling my head with. So I suppose this is the inner captain part of the SHINE process, the I. So I'm looking less on like LinkedIn. I'm more, I suppose, aware of the language that I use and anything that might be negative, because as Estelle mentioned in this episode, if you fill your head with that negative information, it's going to be really unhelpful. So I'm trying to shift my language a little bit around that. So those are definitely the 2 big things that I've taken away from speaking to Estelle and from reading her book so far. But the key thing is to use information like this and actually take some form of action, because if you don't, then the information doesn't end up being useful to you. I do also intend to finish reading her book. I just need to have the time to get around to doing that. The show notes for this episode can be found at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP108. And the show notes include a link to all of Estelle's free resources, her book, a link for details on how to enroll to my tax advice masterclass in November this year. And there's also my email address if you'd like to contact me on there. And there's a link that you can use to register for the 1-month Corona Eye free trial to their tax guidance resources that I use all the time when I'm doing tax research. If you did like this episode, you can head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe to sign up for email notifications. You'll get an email for all future episodes to let you know that they've gone live, and a bit of detail around them too, so that you can decide whether or not you listen. Episodes are released bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.